One night, a 10-year-old boy suddenly woke up from a terrifying nightmare. His heart was pounding, and the room was dark and still, except for one strange thing. There was a steady ticking sound like the ticking of many clocks. The boy sat up in bed, listening closely, but no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't figure out where the sound was coming from. The ticking seemed to be coming from everywhere, and it was growing louder by the second. The boy reassures himself that he's brave and slips out of bed, preparing to find where the sound is coming from. Elsewhere, a man with an angry face wandered the halls as if he was sleepwalking. Without knowing, the boy followed the same path. As he walked down the hall, strange, creepy pictures lined the walls. They scared him, but curiosity kept him moving. He reached a room filled with eerie, haunted artifacts, and it seemed like an occult museum. Instead of running back, he stepped inside, drawn to the strange objects. As he was checking out the artifacts, the ticking sound faded, replaced by an angry noise. His hands shook as he followed the noise. When he reached the spot, he froze. It was the man, furiously swinging an axe at the wall. Panicked, the boy turned and ran back to his room as fast as he could. Just a few days before these events, the young boy named Lewis had just lost his parents. His uncle, Jonathan, wrote him a letter, inviting Lewis to come live with him. When Lewis arrived at the last stop, Uncle Jonathan was waiting for him. Jonathan helped with the boy's luggage. As they walked, a large bell began ringing from a tall building with thick walls, stopping them in their tracks. Jonathan stared at the clock like it was about to attack him, until it finally stopped. Then, they hopped into a vintage car and headed to Jonathan's house, which looked very spooky. When Lewis spotted Jack's pumpkin lanterns, he asked Jonathan if he really loved Halloween, and Jonathan chuckled, saying he keeps those decorations up all year round. Just as they were about to step through the gates, a woman's voice called out. It was Mrs. Hanchett, Jonathan's nosy neighbor. She demands that Jonathan stop playing the saxophone at 3 in the morning. She was even more surprised to see Lewis, and couldn't believe Jonathan was now responsible for keeping another human alive. Inside the house, Lewis was amazed by the number of clocks in the living room. He asked why Jonathan kept many clocks, and Jonathan grinned, saying it was just the right amount. As they settled in, a rustling sound startled Lewis, but his uncle shrugged it off, saying it was just a crazy cuckoo. A slender woman appeared from behind a door. Jonathan introduced her as Mrs. Zimmerman, his next-door neighbor. The two of them joked around and teased each other, but Lewis could sense some strange energy in the house. Jonathan was very strange for an uncle, and tells Lewis they'd be having cookies for dinner, and that all the old rules he lived by were out the window now. Later that night, Lewis was woken up by a loud, clanging noise. Curiosity got the better of him, and he crept out of his room to investigate. He found Jonathan listening closely to the wall. Suddenly, a small statue popped out from a wall decoration. Terrified, Lewis bolted back to his room. The next morning, he found Jonathan and Mrs. Zimmerman gossiping loudly about something strange going on inside the walls. They sent Lewis off to school in a weird, almost suspicious way, making him wonder what was really going on. In school, he played baseball with a boy named Tarby, who asked where Lewis lived. When Lewis told him, Tarby was shocked and said the house was haunted, and scared him by revealing that a man had died there. That night, Lewis had a strange dream where his mother appeared and warned him about a book and a key, telling him he was in danger. When Lewis asked what she meant, she asked if he could hear the ticking. He turned toward the wall, but before he could understand, he woke up. He starts hearing the ticking of the clocks, like his mom mentioned in the dream. Like in the opening scene, determined to find out what was going on, Lewis followed the sounds and saw more strange things. He grew frightened and lost track of the footsteps, only to find Jonathan pounding on the wall with an axe. Panicking, Lewis ran back to his room and started packing his things. As he tried to leave, a picture on the wall told him not to go, and a chair blocked his way to the door. Desperate, Lewis pounded on the door, yelling for help. Jonathan appeared behind him, calming him down and assuring him that everything was fine and that he would never axe murder him. Taking Lewis to the library, Jonathan finally told him the truth. He was a warlock whose life purpose is to practice witchcraft, and the house used to belong to another warlock named Isaac. Isaac had died a year ago, but before he did, he hid a mysterious clock somewhere in the house, and now Jonathan wanted it for a reason, and he doesn't tell Lewis about it. Lewis begged Jonathan to teach him to become a warlock. Jonathan agreed, but handed him a stack of books, telling Lewis to finish reading them first. When Lewis asked if he'd have to defeat some evil spirit to become a warlock, Jonathan laughed, saying that wouldn't happen for a long time. Suddenly, a purple spider crawled out from behind the door, surprising them both. Jonathan explained it was actually Mrs. Zimmerman's pet, and her spells had been backfiring lately. He also warned Lewis never to open a particular cabinet in the house, as it was locked with powerful spells, and the spells wouldn't work towards Jonathan's dear ones. While Jonathan read a book about Isaac's life, Mrs. Zimmerman came in, saying she had searched the crawl space but still hadn't found the hidden clock. The night was lit by a full moon, and it was Lewis' first attempt at performing magic. His first spell was a flop, but Jonathan reassured him that attitude was more important than the spell itself. Lewis found that strange, so Jonathan decided to show him something even stranger. He pulled out his saxophone and started playing, which annoyed all the neighborhood dogs. When he finished, Jonathan pointed to a fountain and told Lewis to tap the still water. The moment he did, tiny stars whooshed out, and the sky above them filled with a magical display of planets and stars. Lewis was mesmerized, enjoying the scene, until a garden lion statue, well, let's just say it made a mess on him. Lewis' magic skills quickly improved. He turned a cat's white fur into rainbow colors, and even made Jonathan float in the air without knowing how to bring him down. Meanwhile, Jonathan was growing worried about the mysterious ticking clock in the house, but Mrs. Zimmerman reassured him they would find it before it caused any harm. As Lewis' magic got better, he used it for everything, like making his bed and even creating a magical TV. At school, Tarby won the elections and didn't feel comfortable hanging out with Lewis anymore. Still, Lewis convinced Tarby to come over so he could teach him some magic tricks that might help with sports. Back at home, Jonathan had discovered the location of the hidden clock. He lifted the arm of a statue, which opened a secret passage inside a lion statue's mouth. Jonathan followed the passage to a large room, where he found the secret lair which belonged to Isaac. It had a huge telescope and objects of astronomy. On a nearby table, he spotted a chart and was overjoyed with what he found. Meanwhile, Lewis was in the library with Tarby, looking for a spell to perfect his curveball. Tarby, being curious, opened the forbidden cabinet and pulled out a book on necromancy. Lewis quickly returned the book and escorted Tarby out of the house. At the same time, Jonathan and Mrs. Zimmerman finally understood an important illustration on the chart Jonathan had found. That night, Lewis' mother appeared in his dream again, reminding him about the forbidden book. She hinted that if he used it, he could win Tarby over. The next day, Lewis convinced Tarby to give him another chance at magic, promising something even bigger, which was raising people from the dead. Lewis secretly stole the forbidden book and met Tarby at the cemetery. The book led them to a specific grave, and while Tarby relaxed in a corner, Lewis cast the spell. When the tomb began to shake, Tarby panicked and ran off, leaving Lewis alone. Lewis also fled back home, quickly returned the book, and jumped into bed. The next morning, Lewis woke up to find his spells weren't working anymore. Jonathan noticed that all the artifacts in the house had gathered on the ground floor, repeatedly whispering someone is coming for them, and he who shall not be named is back home. Alarmed, Jonathan rushed to the cemetery, only to find Isaac's tomb wide open. Jonathan knew he couldn't face Isaac alone, so he asked Mrs. Zimmerman to help. She hesitated, saying she wasn't sure she could help, but insisted that Jonathan needed to tell Lewis the truth. Jonathan argued that Lewis was just a boy and he might not be able to process what's happening. Together, they hammered horseshoes into the front doorway as protection. But when Jonathan went to get more, he froze in front of a large wall painting. It had changed. Now, it showed all of them lying in separate coffins. Lewis was just about to confess to Jonathan about raising Isaac from the dead, but before he could, Mrs. Zimmerman spoke up. She said, eyeing Lewis, that whoever did it would be very sorry when they find them. Nervous, Lewis kept his secret and decided to follow Jonathan's advice to stay with Mrs. Zimmerman for a while. At Mrs. Zimmerman's house, Lewis noticed that she struggled to make magic sparks like Jonathan could. He also saw a picture of Jonathan performing magic alongside Isaac. Mrs. Zimmerman explained that Isaac and Jonathan were once best friends, but everything changed after Isaac went to war in Germany. There, Isaac got lost in the Black Forest, a place full of old, dark magic. He had met a powerful warlock who gave him some forbidden books, one of which was now locked away by Jonathan. Lewis suddenly realized it was the same book that Tarby had made him open. After returning from the war, Isaac became a much darker and fiercer wizard. He eventually abandoned Jonathan and married a wicked witch named Selena. Mrs. Zimmerman revealed that Isaac had probably killed Selena in a blood ritual, using her bones to create a key. At school, Lewis tried to talk to Tarby about what they had done in the cemetery, warning that Jonathan was in big trouble. But Tarby told him to stay quiet, threatening to break his arms if he said anything. When Lewis resisted, Tarby punched him. Lewis fell to the ground, but as he lay there, he saw the word indomitable on an open page of his book, and it gave him strength. He stood up, determined, and went back home. In the library, Lewis found a chart on a table. The doors slammed shut, and books began flying around, hitting him. He shouted for help, and Jonathan and Mrs. Zimmerman rushed in. After things calmed down, Mrs. Zimmerman retrieved the chart, and Lewis, using what he had learned from watching TV, helped crack the code. Jonathan realized that the clock hidden in the house was a doomsday clock. It was designed to reverse time, making people younger and younger until they disappeared. To activate it, Isaac needed the bone key, created with blood magic. Jonathan, Lewis, and Mrs. Zimmerman returned to their home to find the house torn apart. Jonathan explained that Isaac had been searching for the bone key, and they tried to destroy it, but it wouldn't melt. That's when Lewis finally confessed. He had raised Isaac from the dead. Jonathan, furious and scared, decided to send Lewis away, despite the boy's desperate pleas to stay. Mrs. Zimmerman promised Lewis that she would talk to Jonathan and try to change his mind. Outside, Lewis heard Marmalade, Mrs. Hanchett's dog, yapping. He looked out the window and saw Isaac inside Mrs. Hanchett's house. Panicked, Lewis rushed over to warn her and brought her back to Jonathan's house, ignoring all her confused questions. Once they were inside, Lewis called for Jonathan and Mrs. Zimmerman. But before they could respond, the door locked on its own. Isaac then knocked on the main door, where Lewis and Mrs. Hanchett were. Despite Lewis' warnings, Mrs. Hanchett opened the door. Isaac greeted them, and Mrs. Hanchett revealed a shocking truth. She had been Selena, Isaac's wife, all along. To make things even stranger, Marmalade the dog transformed into a rat. Lewis, stunned, said he thought Selena had died, but Selena explained that the bone key had been made from the real Mrs. Hanchett's bones. She had shapeshifted to Mrs. Hanchett the night Isaac had supposedly died. Suddenly, Selena shook her head and transformed into the image of Lewis' mother. Lewis realized that the woman who had appeared in his dreams wasn't just a dream. It had been Selena, pretending to be his mother. She told Lewis that she had used him all along because she couldn't get close to the locked cabinet, thanks to Jonathan's magic spells. Isaac then turned to Lewis and forces him to get the key for them, or else he would kill everyone he loves. Meanwhile, Jonathan and Zimmerman managed to escape the room, but as they hurried toward their secret hideout, they stumbled right into a trap set by Isaac. Lewis was suspended mid-air in a cage, hanging dangerously over sharp blades below. A rat gnawed at the rope holding the cage, ready to snap at any moment. Isaac demanded the key in exchange for releasing Lewis, and with a twisted smile, he began to reveal his dark story. During the war, Isaac had witnessed the terrible destruction caused by humanity. Desperate to stop the suffering, he hadn't met a witch as people believed, but instead, he encountered Azazel, the fourth prince of hell. Azazel offered him a potion and planted the idea of creating a doomsday clock. Isaac's grand plan was to turn back time to the very beginning, erasing all of humanity, so only he and Selena would remain. Zimmerman argued that humans would eventually be born again, but Isaac assured her that Azazel would prevent it, declaring that humans were the real curse of the world. Isaac tried to use magic to steal the key from Jonathan's pocket while threatening Zimmerman, but in a sudden burst of power, Zimmerman unleashed great magic, stopping Isaac in his tracks. She quickly saved Lewis, preventing Selena from getting her hands on the key. Just as Jonathan was about to take the key, Isaac blasted him with a blinding light, but Zimmerman stepped in again, protecting Jonathan. Unfortunately, Isaac managed to grab the key and vanished with Selena by his side. Outside, chaos broke loose as the artifacts and the Jack's pumpkin lanterns chased Jonathan, Lewis, and Zimmerman out of the house. Hearing the previous conversation between Isaac and Selena, Lewis had learned where the hex was and led them back. Zimmerman used her magic to fight off all the enchanted artifacts. However, just as they neared the hex, a giant purple hybrid of octopus and snake, conjured by Isaac, attacked Zimmerman, slowing her down. Isaac and Selena were close to activating the clock. Jonathan reached them just in time, blasting fire at them, but Isaac's magic deflected the attack, throwing Jonathan aside. Using Selena's blood, Isaac activated the clock, setting his dark plan into motion and fled the place. Jonathan tried to stop the clock with his magic cards, but instead, he turned into a baby, powerless to stop it. Now it was up to Lewis. The clock began to rewind time, making people younger by the second. The magical ball whispered to Lewis to say goodbye. Summoning all his courage, Lewis threw the ball into the clock. It hooked onto the gears, halting the countdown. Lewis gathered the red bolts of magic from the clock and directed them at Isaac and Selena, turning them into helpless babies. With Isaac and Selena defeated, the world was saved. Jonathan returned to his adult self, and together with Zimmerman, they decided to live their lives together, creating a new family full of magic and love.